Hi, I'm Lyle Stevick, and this is the fourth video in a series on how to make a 3D printed hand drum. This video is on how to make the bolt flange. In my old design, the bolt flange was a separate part. In my new design, the flange is actually part of the bottom of the drum body. This saves about 50 to 100 grams of material, and it also makes it a lot easier to assemble the drum. Now, to make the bolt flange, the first thing I do is I go into the part workbench and I add a cylinder. I make the radius 10 millimeters. Now, if I look at this cylinder, if I single click on it in my model, it gives me that first view. If I double click on it, it gives me this view. So I set the radius as 10 millimeters, the height as 19 millimeters, and in order to keep the cylinder from going through the inside of the drum, I'm going to set the rotational angle at 180 degrees. This is also why I'm using two cylinders instead of a tube. So the first cylinder will be the outside of it, and then the second one I'll make into the hole. So here I am setting the rotational angle at 180 degrees. And then I set X at 0, Y at 80, and Z at -1. So that'll give me the location. Now, the bolt is going through at an 8-degree angle. So I want to set the angle of this at 8 degrees. And if I scroll down a little bit here, you'll see the angle part. Now, each of these numbers, the X, Y, and Z, is the proportion of the angle. 1 is 100%. So now I set the X at 1, or 100%, and the angle at 8 degrees. Now I go into the draft workbench. Okay, first I check and make sure that it is where I want it. And you can see that it is at an angle of 8 degrees, rotated on the x-axis. So now I go into the draft workbench and I left click on my cylinder, and then I click on polar array. I'm going to have 12 bolts for this drum, so I'm going to type in 12 and then return all these numbers back to 0. And then click OK. So now this looks like this is all one part, but it's actually an array and a body. So it's two separate parts. So I want to go back into the part workbench and I want to fuse these two together. So I left click on the body and then shift left click on the array, and then I join the two in a Boolean operation. Now it shows it as a fusion, or as one single part. So now I want to go back into the part workbench and add my second cylinder. I'm going to make this one a radius of 4 millimeters because I'm using on this drum 6 millimeter bolts, and 4 millimeters a radius will give me a diameter of 8 millimeters, which gives me clearance for the bolt. I make it a height of 30 millimeters, and then I define the X, Y, and Z location as Y of 83.5 and Z of -2. And then again, on the angle, I want the rotation to be 100% in the X direction and an angle of 8 degrees. And you can see that that lines up. And then I go back into the draft workbench and I turn that second cylinder into a second array of cylinders. So I click on Polar Array and I type in 12 and then return all of those numbers to 0. And when I click on OK, there I have my 12 cylinders that will be turned into 12 holes. So now I go back into the part workbench, I left click on the fusion, and then shift and left click on the cylinder array, and I click on cut. And then I double check to make sure that it went all the way through. And now if I zoom in, you're going to see that the angle on the bottom here, that's not going to work without support. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to cut that at 30 degrees. So I go into my part workbench and I create a cube. And I set the cube as 30 by 30 by 10. And then on the location I put X at -15, Y at 72, and Z at -18. Then I scroll down to the angle and I set the rotation at 30 degrees, 100% in the X direction. Now this is something, in order to get right, you sometimes have to play with this and just move it a little bit at a time and see what happens. So there I've got 100% in the X direction and at 30 degrees. Now if I zoom in on this, and this is where I make the adjustments, I zoom in really close, but I've already done that. So this is just to show you that this is going to give me my cut exactly where I want it. So I click OK on that, and then go back into the draft workbench and turn that into an array of cubes. So that's my third Boolean operation, and then my fourth one is the easy one. So first I have to reset all those numbers to 0. And and then click OK. And then go back into the part workbench. Left click on the body, shift and left click on the array of cubes, and then click cut. And I'm almost done. But if you zoom in, you'll see that part of my first cylinder extends past the plane that I want to print on. So I want to make one big cube and just cut that off. And this cube I set as a length of 300, a width of 300, and a height of 10. And then I center it by going minus 150 in the X direction, minus 150 in the Y direction, and then minus 10 in the Z direction. Now I'm already in the part workbench, so I don't have to change workbenches here. I just take a look at it, see that yes, that's what I'm looking for, and then I click OK. I left click on the body, I shift and left click on my cube, and then I click on cut. And there it is. That is my completed drum body bottom. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I have one more video in series on how to decorate a drum with 2-part epoxy and glitter. Thank you for watching.